from her brother-in-law's.
Perfect.
So, well, yes, thank you. Yes, I'm Stacy Campbell, one of the ag agents here in the Cottonwood District, and we're joined with Romulo Lollato, our wheat and forage specialist here with K-State Research and Extension. And we were scheduled to be out at our wheat variety plot, which is just across the road, but of course, with all the rain and the cool weather, we decided to bring it inside. So I'm glad we did that. It's pretty wet and muddy out there. So we've got 16 varieties planted across the road, and we'll kind of touch on that in a little bit. But I guess with Romulo here, first of all, we wanted to just let Romulo maybe talk a little bit, and we'll talk back and forth. But Romulo is going to kind of touch a little bit on just the wheat conditions that he's seeing currently around the state right now.
Yeah, sure thing, and I appreciate Stacy and Alicia the invitation to be here and do this wheat plot tour. It seems like every year that we have a wheat plot tour in Great Bend here, this early April time frame, it's freezing, freezing cold, and so it's good to be inside here today. But make sure that check out on May 25th, right, Stacy, that we're going to have the in-person plot tour.
Yes, we'll have a plot tour also in May 25th. Yes.
Yeah, so just make sure that stop by there and we can discuss each of the varieties more in detail. But yeah, talking about the wheat conditions around the state, whenever we think of these 2020, 2021 wheat crop, so far we need to think of the conditions that we had back in the fall. So what happened back in the fall, right? We had some rainfall in September. That, Stacy, allowed for a good emergence of those early planted crops, right? The wheat that got planted mid-September to late September overall had a pretty good stand establishment and a pretty good fall development as well. Now, rainfall really shut down in that October time frame, and so the month of October and into early November, we really had no rainfall at all. So even though growers were planting the wheat in a good timing, right, the month of October is optimum for several parts of the state, it never really emerged until November. And so we really have two very different wheat crops around the state, right, in general. One that got planted relatively early and have a good development and it's looking good. And another one that got planted late, but not only planted late, especially it emerged really late. And so throughout the winter, it was a very, very small crop. Right, so we have these two very contrasting crops out there. Then the conditions on the fall, they were relatively dry. We got into the winter on a relatively warm winter there, but if you remember in February, mid-February time frame, we had some extremely cold temperatures around the state. Right, so we had temperatures measured as low as like a -29. So we were very concerned with the potential for winter kill at that point in time. A few of the conditions that were concerning us were that first, the air temperatures were very low, down to -29 Fahrenheit there. We also had a relatively dry soil that doesn't help much, buffer those temperatures, right? And we had very limited snow cover. So we had 1 or 2 inches only of snow cover, not much there to buffer those cold temperatures. But at that point in time, Stacy, the temperatures, they were maintained at about, the soil temperatures, they were maintained at about those meeting temperatures for most of the state. So that was promising, because usually if the soil temperatures reach negative or single-digit values, right, that's when we tend to see more winter kill. So that was promising back then. Continuing on the trajectory of the crop this year, we had quite a bit of rain in that after March 12, more or less, anywhere from 4 to 6 inches throughout the state, plus this rain of yesterday, right? And so that added up to, we were just talking now, up to 4 inches in certain parts of the state there again. And so that's definitely helping the crop bounce back for any potential injury that it might have had from those extremely cold temperatures in the winter there. And it's definitely a time now that the crop really needs their water for uptake of nitrogen, uptake of different nutrients as well.
Right. Yeah, it's been amazing, like you said. The wheat just kind of stalled, if you will, because we were getting pretty dry in the winter and very early spring. But now that we've had the moisture, it has really taken off and just grown, and a lot of it looks quite well. So Romulo, kind of one of the things we were discussing before we came up here, as always, there's a discussion about fertility management And some people maybe try to get all their fertilizer down in the fall, or they split apply it fall and spring. I think kind of the main point, of course, is just to make sure you do get the fertility out there. And what are you seeing around the state as you've had interaction with growers, and what any questions they've had on fertility with nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, so forth on the wheat crop?
Yeah, that's a good question. Very important topic there as well on fertility, right? So far, for the growers who graze their crop, we typically suggest that the fall application of anhydrous might be a good way to go for those who are grazing, right? Because then perhaps a little bit cheaper nitrogen source, but not only that, it really maximizes that forage production. And growers who did that this year, it's looking pretty good because of that September rainfall, right? That was able to really take the most out of that nitrogen. Now, our recommendation for grain-only type of systems is really a split application. So we might have a 30-40% of the nitrogen applied back in the fall, just so the crop has enough nitrogen out there to promote tiller, right? Make sure that they're not limiting our fall tiller production. And then really come with the bulk of that application in either one shot in the spring or a couple, or even splitting a couple shots in the spring there. Some of our research over the last 5-6 years here have been showing that split application really you use the nitrogen more efficiently, right? The nitrogen goes really into the grain more efficiently if we're splitting that nitrogen application. So definitely we need to be thinking about that if we're not raising the crop, right? So we need to be thinking about that split nitrogen application. With sulfur, it's about the same thing, right? Sulfur is very similar to nitrogen. Now, we have been seeing more and more sulfur deficiency around the state, and that's because, we have less pollution going into the air, and so less sulfur coming down in the atmosphere with the rainfall. But the timing of sulfur uptake by the crop is exactly the same as nitrogen, right? So by the time that the crop starts starts heading out, 70-80% of the sulfur should already be uptake. So our timing is critical there, that we put most of the sulfur just together with the nitrogen, right? We can do that application in the spring as well. We're seeing a lot of response to sulfur in sandier soils with lower organic matter. Sometimes when we're working in silt-loam soils with 2-2.5% organic matter, we might not see that response because that organic matter might release sulfur to the crop as well, right? So it's really specific to those conditions where sulfur is more limited, like a sandier soil, lower in organic matter. And you also mentioned phosphorus, right? Phosphorus fertility. And if we think, folks, about the response of the wheat crop to phosphorus, it's probably the most responsive crop that we have out there in terms of tillering, right? So if we're putting that phosphorus in furrow with the seed, it's really going to bump up the number of tillers that the crop is producing. And in a year like this year, when half of the crop or more is actually emerging very late, I tend to think of that as money in the bank, right? So there are a few situations where I like to think of improved phosphorus as money in the bank. One of them is late planting, like we had quite a bit of that in Kansas this year. Another one is if you're grazing the crop, right? If you're grazing the crop, that improved phosphorus is really going to produce more biomass. The third, acid soils, right? If we have a low pH conditions, the phosphorus can act as a band-aid. It's not really a correction, but it's a band-aid. For that year, the crop might get by just because we're putting that phosphorus in furrow, making it available to the plant. So in those three situations, I think phosphorus is money in the bank, but regardless of that, wheat is very responsive to phosphorus. So if you have a soil test B there of maybe in that 25 parts per million or less, you're probably in the responsive range to the crop.
Okay. Yeah, Romulo, and on nitrogen and top dressing, I kind of scratch my head a little bit every year when I'm still sometimes seeing guys top dressing in this past week, or even a few guys finishing up. I guess ideally we'd like to see that nitrogen get put on earlier. Why would that be?
Yeah, that's a good question there, Stacy. And so if you think of the crop and what's happening within the crop, within that plant, right, and the reason we want it earlier in the spring is because nitrogen is going to still allow the crop to produce more tillers. And right now, when the crop gets out of the winter dormancy, it goes into the spring growth, it's also the time when the crop is developing those little heads, right? The little heads are developing underneath the crown, and as the stem elongates, that the wheat head's already developing. By the time we have our first joint out there, the head size is done, is developed. So the head size potential, right? So if that head's going to hold 40 berries, the potential has already been determined that early. Likewise, if we have nitrogen deficiency, maybe those heads are only going to be able to hold 25 or 30 berries, right? So because we determine the potential head size as early as from tillering to jointing, that's why we need that nitrogen early on. And also, so this is from a crop perspective, but also from a weather perspective. The earlier we have it out there in the spring, the greater the chances are that rainfall is going to incorporate it into the root zone and it's really going to be absorbed. And that's critical, right? I mean, it needs to be in the root zone in order for it to be absorbed by the ground.
Right, yeah, you've got the nitrogen cycle. I mean, that nitrogen has to have some moisture to get it activated. The microbes have to go to work on it and utilize it some, release some back to the soil. It takes a little while for that nitrogen to be available to the plant, if you will. And something that I know you've ran across, I think we all have, is you mentioned sulfur, and that we're probably lacking a little bit of that in our atmosphere anymore. And nitrogen and sulfur deficiencies are very similar. If you're not kind of familiar with what to look for, they can be confused, as to which it is.
Yeah, it definitely can be tricky, and I'm glad that you brought that up, Stacy, because the main difference, so both of them are going to turn the wheat leaves kind of yellow. Right? Now, the main difference that we see between nitrogen and sulfur is that inside the plant, nitrogen is mobile, right? So think of the plant, if it uptakes the nitrogen already, it's going to be able to move from the older leaves to the new ones. So if there's deficiency, that yellowing is going to occur in the bottom, right? It's going to occur in the lower leaves. Sulfur is much less mobile inside the plant, and so if there's sulfur deficiency, it's also going to become yellow. But now, because it's non-mobile, the yellow is going to be on the upper leaves, on the new growth. So that also gives a distinct appearance if you're from the road and just looking at the crop from the road.
Yeah.
Because the sulfur is going to look more as a bright yellow because it's at the top of the canopy, compared to the nitrogen, which is more of a pale yellow because those leaves on the bottom. So.
Yeah, that was kind of, I guess, where I was going, is just driving by. Oftentimes, I think people may think that's a nitrogen deficiency, but it could be sulfur as well.
Yeah, and if you put nitrogen, it doesn't do anything, right? So if we briefly, some of these research that we have had with the Kansas Wheat Commission for the last 3 years or so, they're looking at the interaction of nitrogen and sulfur. If we are in a sulfur deficient soil, right? Think of it as perhaps a low organic matter sandy site. We can put as much as 150 units of nitrogen there, and we have no response to nitrogen at all. Putting 50 or 150 was a flat line. Now, once we provided sulfur, first thing that we did is at the 50 nitrogen rate, we already bumped the yields up in a good 15 bushel per acre just there. Not only that, the crop now became responsive to nitrogen. So as we gave more nitrogen, the yields improved even further, right? So it was essentially a flat line in response to nitrogen without sulfur, and more of like an increasing line in response to nitrogen with 10 or 20 units of sulfur. So the crop doesn't need much. 80 bushel crop is going to uptake a total there of 22 pounds of sulfur, but it needs those pounds of sulfur available in order to produce yield in situations where it is deficient. So.
Okay, very good. All right, next thing, fungicide diseases. Of course, it's still, I haven't read lately about what's going on down south. Maybe you could tell us a little bit as to what they're seeing down south as far as diseases, and then we can maybe talk a little bit about fungicides too.
Yes, most definitely. So in Oklahoma, they have been reporting some striped rust already. Quite a bit of spot and septoria as well. So those diseases, they are already happening south of us. And with the amount of rainfalls that we have had recently in Kansas, very likely that's going to move up north, right? So the way that those diseases work, especially striped rust, is that it first occurs in Texas, and then if it's detected there and there's rainfall that come up, usually moves those spores up as well. Actually, there's some recent K-State research showing that a wet fall in Texas is really good, really conducive for striped rust here in Kansas in the spring. So what happens south of us really matters, and they have already been detected there. we have had moistures that would have brought up those spores. So I would think that now, as the crop is elongating the stem, is going to reach a flag leaf stage here pretty soon in parts of the state, or even ahead of that, if we go to very far south central Kansas, southwest Kansas there, we will start seeing stripe rust here pretty soon. So it might be a year where if you're planting a susceptible variety, it might be warranted to spray a further fungicide.
Right, but of course, the best thing to do is to get out and look at those fields, especially the ones that are more susceptible, to make sure before you pull the trigger on that. You mentioned your fungicide, you mentioned the flag leaf. Obviously, that's really the leaf we're trying to cover for disease protection. It seems like the flag leaf does most of the heavy lifting in that final yield determination.
Yeah, so in the wheat crop, the flag leaf and the one below it, plus the head, right? The head also is producing sugars there during growing. So those three organs together, the head, the last leaf, and the one before, they really account for up to 80% of whatever starch is putting into the grain. So it's very important that we make sure that those are clean, right? And that's why we always talk in this region about flag leaf application, because that's the bulk of the heavy lifting is done by those three upper organs there. If we wait until the heavy leaf is the flag leaf is emerged, fungicide application will protect the bottom leaves as well. I mean the immediate bottom leaf as well. And so that's usually the fungicide application that does the heavy lifting for us. So in fact, together with the plant pathology department, we went back all the way back to 2008, earlier this year, and we collected data from trials that were comparing, just a simple comparison, with and without fungicide for different varieties with different resistance, right? And so we have 12 years of data. We actually got 56 experiments that we're looking at. It's almost 400 direct comparisons, so with and without fungicide. Across the board, the average yield benefit that we had from that fungicide, that flag leaf, was anywhere from 8 to 10% yield gain, right? So that was across the board, but it ranged from negative sometimes in a very dry year, right? We're going to see some negative, some yield penalties from that fungicide, right? We're just maintaining the green leaf longer. If we don't have water to go with that green leaf, we might have a new decrease, but very few cases. The majority was in that 8 to 10% range, but sometimes we had up to 90+% yield gain in the case where we had a very susceptible variety with very conducive disease conditions, so a lot of stripe rust, for example. And then, of course, the yield difference there, it depended on the variety susceptibility. If we're talking across the board 8 to 10%, in resistant varieties, that's more like about in the 5% range. In susceptible varieties, it's more in that 15% range of yield gain that we have from that fungicide. So there was something very interesting that we were looking the last earlier this year here to try and bring wheat growers a very applied information on how should we be looking to manage that fungicide.
Okay. Yeah, I know the last few years you've done some, I think we kind of touched on it a little bit, you've done some more intensive weed management type studies as to split applications of fungicides and fertility and stuff like that. So there's kind of some ongoing work you're doing on that that you'll probably report back to us down the road. So
yeah, we have some work looking at the dual fungicide application as well, right? One around that first or second node, and then the second one after the flag leaf emerges. In some years, we have seen the benefit of that early one, but those were years where there was an extreme amount of dense spot and septoria, right? So whenever the infection rates or the infestation of septoria or dense spot, those early leaf spotting diseases, whenever it's severe enough that it goes into and goes up in the canopy all the way to the flag leaf, we might actually see a benefit from those early applications. But it's just on those years in these conditions in Kansas.
And would that be more kind of a no-till situation too, probably?
That could lead to higher incidence of those diseases because they survive on the straw.
Yeah,
they will survive on the residue, so they can increase the incidence of those diseases. So again, it's a very specific condition when we had the response to that early fungicide. Whenever it was there, it might have been 3-4 bushels per acre, in a susceptible variety, but in a resistant variety to those leaf spot diseases that are responsible for. So the early one, we're still needing to really figure out when it's best, but so far it looks like it's only on those years when we have extreme infection of tan spot, septoria, and those leaf spot diseases.
And unless things have changed, as far as I know, the fungicide's 23 to 5 days, 21 to 5 days is about as long as they'll last. Is that pretty much right as far as we know?
Yeah, that's correct. So, some generic ones, they might be a little bit less than that, right? We might be looking at perhaps 18 days or something along those lines. If we're buying a top shelf product, it might last up to 23, 25 days of protection. And it only protects the leaves that are there at the time of the application. So that's important to discuss as well. That's why we typically wait until the flag leaf emerges to do the application. But again, if you apply it at flag leaf emergence, right, in some years it might be too early, right? In some years when you have a very extended growth, grain feeding period, I have seen where we started to see some infections later on start, especially in susceptible varieties. But for the most part, in between the flag leaf emergence and heading is a pretty good time.
Okay, very good. Well, Romulo, I think we're kind of rounding out what we're discussing here. We're not going to go down through every variety, but we do have, like I said, 16 varieties out there. We've got several new varieties as well this year. That's something that we're noticing in the wheat industry is the wheat breeders seem to be turning out varieties quicker. So that's a good thing, maybe more challenging for the producers to kind of keep up with the genetics. But tell us just a little bit about some of the varieties that are planted here in the state and what you're seeing, and maybe just overall some variety differences that you're seeing or that you want to talk about.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Stacy, now more and more we have more varieties being released every year, right? It's not uncommon for a given breeding program to release 5 varieties in a year. And we might have 10 or 12 different entities breeding wheat or releasing wheat varieties every year in Kansas. So, in any given year, we may have 20, 25 new wheat varieties out there. And so it's definitely, as a producer, it's kind of hard to keep track, and as an extension specialist as well, right? Because we like to see those varieties many times before we actually talk about them. And more we just don't have the time to keep up with all of those varieties coming out. But so with that, but we do see the new data whenever they're coming down the road, and we kind of like have a good understanding of their area of adaptation, some of their strengths and weaknesses as well. Within K-State, when I talk about a few varieties that we have within K-State that are commercialized by the Kansas Wheat Alliance,
okay,
right? A couple of perhaps ones that have been around for a little bit longer, like 2 or 3 years now, which are Larry and Zenda. Those varieties, they provide a pretty good combination of central and west central adaptation in Larry, and central and eastern Kansas adaptation for Zenda, right? Zenda being very strong in head scab, so for those acres after corn, Zenda has done really well, and it offers protection against a disease that can be really yield reducing in those corn acres, that's head scab. Right, so that'll be more for central and eastern Kansas, and that is really an average replacement, right? So medium early maturity variety, medium tall with a pretty good straw strength. Larry, we're more moving into the central and west central part of the state. It is a variety that brings a better drought tolerance than Zenda, so it has performed better in those conditions where water availability was not as large. Now it doesn't have the scab tolerance that Zenda has, so it probably wouldn't put Larry after corn, but after soybeans, it has done pretty decently. I think it's a pretty good option for us to have there. Medium maturity variety, medium tall, but pretty good straw strength. Now we do have, Stacy, a couple of new wheat varieties there from K-State, kind of one of them for the central part of the state as well, which would be KS Hatchet. Okay. So KS Hatchet is an interesting variety because it's got some induster on the pedigree, right on the background. Induster is a very high yielding variety, and KS Hatchet brings that to the table as well. Very high yielding ability. And so because of that high yielding ability, it has done really well on trials after soybeans. So for those growers in central Kansas who are looking for an alternative there, for example, for a variety that, like SY Monument, for example, that has done really well after soybeans for several years, and is the #1 planted variety in the state, right? But KS Hatch and recent case state trials seem to be outwitting one that in those conditions after soybeans in 2-3 bushels per acre. And so definitely one that I'll keep an eye. It brings pretty good acid soil tolerance, soil-borne mosaic tolerance as well. Coming from that duster background, its straw strength is not the best out there. It is more of like intermediate straw strength, meaning that we're planting too early and feelers too much. There might be some logic. But in those conditions after soybeans, we're typically planting late, and so the crop is shorter anyways. We might not have logic in those conditions. So KS Hatchet, definitely one that I'll be keeping an eye if I'm growing central Kansas going after soybeans. For the western portion of the state also has a breeding program focused on that portion of the state, based in Hayes, right where you're based as well, there, Stacy. We have had the release of KS Dallas that was available already last year for us to see. It's been around for about a year there. The main thing to think about with KS Dallas is that is weed streak mosaic protection. Weed streak mosaic is a huge problem around the state whenever your neighbor is not controlling their own here. Right, weed streak mosaic can be a very big problem. And usually the resistance to weed streak mosaic, it is what we call temperature sensitive. If you have, for example, a variety that has a resistance gene for weed streak mosaic, that gene is going to be active until about 65 Fahrenheit or so. And above that gene is not working anymore. So in some situations, even a resistant variety, it might not offer too much protection if the conditions, for example, are warm in the fall. Now, KS Dallas offers an increased protection to weed streak mosaic because that temperature sensitivity doesn't kick in until about 70 degrees. So we have an extra 5 degrees more or less that of protection, and that can be a game changing in some years. Another new wheat variety from the Western breeding program at K-State, KS Hamilton. It's another one that offers this protection to weed streak mosaic as well, up to about 70 degrees. So really keep an eye on those. Those options give you some differences in maturity and some other differences in agronomics as well that are interesting, especially if you have neighbor that doesn't control the home team, and weed streak mosaic tends to be a problem.
Right. And then Western Star, that's a variety that's a fairly new release too. I think it was released last year or was the year before?
Yeah, KS Western Star, right, that has been released a couple of years ago there. We were able to take a look at it for a couple of years now. Very good lead record on the western part of the state. Good drought tolerance. It does offer protection against the weed curl mite, which is the mite that transmits the weed streak mosaic, but it doesn't have the protection gene against the disease. So it's similar to that 10-112 line of varieties, Avery and Bird, that has better protection against the weed curl mite, but not necessarily against the weed streak mosaic virus there.
Okay.
But maturity-wise, it will be like a medium mature variety in KS Western Star. So yeah, if you're a grower in the western part of the state, definitely one to keep on.
And I know Wolverine is a new variety by Syngenta. SY Wolverine. What are you seeing on it so far?
Yeah, so SY Wolverine was one that has been around for a couple of years now, so that we were able to take a look at that one. Another one that is similar background is AP Everrock. Right, so those two from Syngenta, they're AgroPro, are varieties that are relatively new. AP Everrock is newer, even it's just from last year. Those two varieties, they will have on their background both Everest and SY Wolf. But then SY Wolverine also have black in the background, whereas AP Everrock will have Pulse. Right? Big difference there, in SY Wolverine, you've got some resistance to those leaf-spotting diseases that usually the wolf background is bringing to it. However, it doesn't have much acid soil tolerance. So you got that from wolf as well. So it's more like probably a variety that would be more adapted out west, right? Whereas AP Everrock, again, first year we're seeing it now, so we need to take a better look at it there. But some of the early data is kind of indicating that might be a pretty good option there in the central part of the state.
Okay, all right.
Does it bring some of that? BYD resistance to the table as well. They probably getting that from Everest, which was was for several years the most widely planted wheat in the States.
Okay. Well, Romulo, I think that kind of concludes it, unless you have any other closing comments.
Yeah, no, it's just inviting growers again to make sure and participate on May 25th on the in-person wheat field day that we're going to have here in Ray Bend.
Right.
And also in Victoria, right?
Yeah, the May 25th, I think we're going to have the one here in Barton County. It'll be probably in the morning. We haven't quite set the time yet. And then, yeah, that same day on the 25th, we'll have the one in Ellis County in the evening. It'll be north of Victoria. So, yeah, we'll get some information out on that, on those wheat crop field days coming up. And if you haven't tuned into our Facebook page, we encourage you to do that. We've also got information on our website as well. So, Romulo, I appreciate you coming today, coming out from Manhattan. Sorry that we had cool, wet weather again. I guess I'm not too sorry for the wet weather, but at least the cool weather. And we appreciate it, and we hope to see you back here in a month or so.
Yeah, we won't complain about the rain, and I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.